For those of you who are new to Wild Ones, we are a membership organization devoted to promoting the use of native plants to create sustainable landscapes. We carry out our mission through educational programs and provide resources such as the Wild Ones Journal, native garden designs, Seeds for Education grants, and other educational webinars. At the local level, Wild Ones chapters deliver area programs, including garden tours, speakers, conferences, and seed exchanges. If you are not a Wild Ones member, we hope you join us and take advantage of the camaraderie and support that come with being a part of a local chapter. Our critical mission needs you. Wild Ones chapters are where members put mission into action. We get our hands dirty and learn by doing. Chapters are actively recruiting officers and volunteers to plan upcoming events. Chapter activities require the time and talents of many different people to coordinate. Amplify the impact you have on the native plant movement by sharing your skills and enthusiasm with others. Please reach out to your local chapter to find out how you can get involved. If there isn't a chapter near you, now's the time to consider starting a Wild One seedling chapter. Chapter founders across the country connect and collaborate with one another for mutual support and guidance. If you are eager to advance the mission and cultivate support for native plants in your area, visit the Start a Chapter page on the Wild Ones website. Wild Ones inspires people and communities across the country to transform home landscapes into vibrant and essential habitats for all forms of life. Programs like this would not be possible without generous support from our members, donors, and folks like you attending Wild Ones programs. Please consider donating to Wild Ones today by visiting donate.wildones.org.
Thank you for joining us for the Wild Ones Native Garden Design Series. My name is Matthew Ross, and I'll be your host for this discussion. I've been a Wild One member since 2012, part of the Oak Openings chapter. I've been a partner at large, or PALE. I've also been a member of the Southeastern Pennsylvania chapter and currently serve on the Wild Ones Board of Directors. I'm honored to be talking with designer Larry Weaner, the designer of the Wild Ones Washington, D.C. Native Garden Design. Wild Ones Native Garden Designs follow the premise that native plant landscaping can be beautiful, beneficial, and achievable for gardeners of all skill sets in terms of scope and budget. This program contains resources that include information on how to get started by identifying your ecoregion, selecting and determining plant placement in your yard, considering your own specific climate conditions, and finding local native plant nurseries in your area. The program also features a growing number of free, downloadable native garden designs created by professional landscape designers representing various ecoregions throughout the United States. A plant list accompanies each design and provides a quick preview of the diversity and beauty of the native plants incorporated in the design, as well as phased installation approach, all of which can be downloaded and printed easily at home. All designs are assembled using native plants that provide habitat and food for wildlife that offer a colorful and beautiful garden throughout the growing season. We hope these resources inspire, encourage, and motivate you on your native garden journey. We are honored to have designer Larry Weaner here today. Larry Weaner is a fellow of the Association of Professional Landscape Designers, founded Larry Weaner Landscape Associates in 1982, and established New Directions in the American landscape in 1990. He's nationally recognized for combining expertise in horticulture, landscape design, and ecological restoration. His design and restoration work spans more than 20 U.S. states and the United Kingdom, and has been profiled in national publications including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Landscape Architecture Magazine, and many others. His book, Garden Revolution: How Our Landscapes Can Be a Source of Environmental Change, published in 2016, received an American Horticulture Society Book Award in 2017. And in 2021, Larry received the American Horticultural Society's Landscape Design Award. Larry, it's a pleasure to speak with you today and glad to have you joining us.
Thank you for inviting me to create this design and be here today to talk about the design. And I just have to say I have nothing but admiration for the Wild Ones and have been aware of and in communication with that organization for a long, long time. Back when Laureato founded it, I believe in Wisconsin, Milwaukee area. So it's great work that you folks do, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And also thank you for being one of our honorary directors. So we're very pleased to have you with us today. For those of
Honored
us
to be asked.
For those of us who are less familiar with the Washington, D.C. area, would you please share a little bit of information about the typical weather, climate conditions, including the seasons, temperatures, and weather patterns you experience in this area?
Well, it's basically, obviously, we're on the East Coast. Things are very different than other areas from a rainfall standpoint. We are getting, as the screen says, about 42 inches of precipitation per year. It can be cool and cold. The winter temperatures can vary greatly, especially these days. We were in the 20s yesterday and we're in the 50s today. So there's a lot of variation, and it's somewhat less predictable, I would say, than it used to be. We used to get much more frost, I would say, in the ground. It was never, the DC area was never an area that would be generally have a deep frost or any frost throughout the winter. But now frost, any kind of deep frost that sticks around for a while is pretty rare. So things are changing, and we're learning to adapt to those changes. But not only do, let's say, rainfall patterns matter in terms of the plants and some that may require more or less rain, there's other ramifications, and one very important one, and I think it's good to compare how plants operate in different areas of the country, even if you're not in some of those areas. For instance, in the East, in much of the East Coast, certainly Washington, D.C. area, there is sufficient rainfall that most landscapes end up forming a solid vegetative cover over the ground layer. And consequently, when plants disperse seeds into that dense competitive vegetation, seeds don't germinate at any high rate because they are suppressed by the dense vegetation. If you happen to be in the southeastern United States, where it's much drier, not only do those plants need to tolerate dry conditions, but they operate differently from a proliferation standpoint. For instance, in the Texas Hill Country, they don't get enough rainfall for a solid vegetative cover to occur. So when plants distribute their seeds, the germination rate is much higher because there is not a dense weed suppressive cover. So one of the aspects of this kind of design approach is to look a little deeper into how plants operate than some of the things that a horticulturist, a good horticulturist, would think about. Rainfall matters because certain plants require or have tolerances for different levels of moisture, but it also matters significantly for how they are proliferating out in the landscape. So it's just one example.
Great. And it was really interesting to hear you talk about the hill country and the proliferation of seeds with a non-vegetative cover and having some open spaces for them in nature. But if you were moving to this area and you were thinking about starting a garden, what would be some of the priorities that you would have, or what would be some of the factors you would consider in making a native garden thrive in the Washington, D.C. area?
Right. First, the obvious one would be to determine what ecoregion you're in. One question I ask is, where am I, ecologically speaking? And it's not, the answer is not Virginia or Pennsylvania or Texas. The answer is because there are many different environmental types that relate to what plants grow there within each of those states. So you're really looking at what ecoregion you're in. And if you look at the ecoregion map of the state you're in, you'll see that there are a lot of differences in terms of what the environment is, depending on where you are in the state. And the Washington, D.C. area, interestingly enough, kind of falls right on the border of the coastal plains and the Piedmont, which are two very different, particularly soil types and topographical types, whereas the coastal plain tends to be a very well-drained sand, and the Piedmont tends to be a heavier clay, less porous than the sandy soil. So you really are kind of in the middle of those two. And then the third thing that I would throw in there, which is the reality of where we work, is disturbances. If you are operating in the city of Washington, D.C., most of the soils have been historically moved or changed or graded, and you're not sitting there in a pristine situation. You're in a situation that I would describe as disturbed. Even if you were out in the suburbs, historically, it may have been plowed, meaning the soil was homogenized, the layers and horizons that existed prior to European agriculture have been disturbed. So the idea is to understand what ecoregion you're in, number one, which will lead you to what plants are native to where you're working. And number two, has the site that I am working on been historically disturbed? Meaning, has the soil been moved, tilled? And if that is the case, you are not in this pristine situation anymore within your ecoregion. And this is very real and practical. And there's a very practical guide in selecting plants in that situation. If you are in, as most of us are, a disturbed situation where the original soil conditions of that ecoregion no longer exist, there's a certain type of plant that you want to be moving towards. And that is what are called generalists. There are generalist species and specialist species. Generalist species can grow in a wide variety of environmental types, meaning they are more likely to survive in disturbed conditions, historically disturbed soil conditions. Specialist species basically have a very narrow window of where they can survive. So disturbed conditions are generally, you are not going to succeed with a plant palette that's heavy on specialists. So this seems to be getting a little deep into ecological theory, but if you are out there trying to get plants to work in the landscape, generalists are where you generally want to be if you are in a disturbed condition. Alternatively, in the rare situations where you're more remote and you can determine that agriculture didn't plow things up and grading didn't occur for a development, you may be able to use specialists. So one of the first things we're looking at is, are we in a very disturbed situation, or are we in a situation where some of the historic conditions still exist? And if we are in a disturbed situation, we are going to stick with mostly generalists. If we are in a situation where the historic conditions still exist, we can move more towards specialist species. And I know this is a bit of a long description, but it's very important. And I'll say one last thing about it is, I'm sure in your minds, you're saying, how do I know which species is a specialist and which is a generalist? Very easy. If you go on your computer and Google the name of the plant you are interested in, learning whether they are specialists or generalists, and then type in coefficients of conservatism. Coefficients of conservatism. What that is, it's a scale from 0 to 10. And if you are a 0, you are an extreme generalist and you can grow almost anywhere. If you're a 10, you are an extreme specialist and you probably shouldn't touch that plant because you are very unlikely to have the conditions where that plant would thrive. And if you're a 5, you're kind of in the middle. So just to kind of recap, am I in a disturbed condition where I need to stick with generalists, or I am in a more pristine condition where it was not historically disturbed and I can try to achieve more of a specialist landscape? How do I know the difference? Type in the name to your computer, type in coefficients of conservatism, come up with a number. If it's a 3, I'm in good shape. I can probably use it in a disturbed condition. If it's an 8 or a 9, I better make sure that I have the exact conditions for that plant. And most places you won't.
That's a really great point, Larry. And thank you for your insight and your ecological theory that sets the pretense for your garden design. You mentioned disturbance, and much of the U.S. has experienced some degree of climate change in the past 10 to 20 years. What climate conditions have you noticed or observed in your area during this time frame?
Well, storms have been heavier, droughts have been more frequent, and the average temperatures certainly have risen in our area. That said, there's great variations. It seems like there are, you know, from day to day and week to week, things can change much more dramatically than previously occurred. I'm not a climatologist, so there's only so deep that I can go into that. But things are pretty obvious. But one of the things that I would say, there's more to considering climate change than just the temperatures will get warmer. As I mentioned, droughts, heavier storms. But I think one of the real general approaches that we can take here, beyond just using some of the plants from the south as things get warmer, more southerly from where we are operating, is to make sure that we are planting seed-grown plants, native seed-grown plants. Why do I say seed-grown? Because they are sexually propagated. Consequently, there's genetic diversity even within a specific species. If these plants are seed-grown, there is genetic diversity within individuals. If they are a cultivar or a selection that is asexually propagated, every single plant is genetically the same. As climate is changing, rainfall is changing, droughts are changing, temperatures are changing, genetic diversity is a major weapon for plants to be able to adapt. There will be some individuals that can tolerate longer drought periods. And so while some plants may struggle, there will be individuals in that species that are more likely to be adapted to the changing conditions, and consequently our landscapes will be more adaptable, not just to rising temperatures, but all the other climatic changes that go with it.
So you mentioned two things. You mentioned having genetic diversity amongst your planting, and then also you mentioned a little bit about assisted migration. Are there other design aspects that you use to combat climate change, and in looking at native plants and utilizing them? How can they help mitigate some of these changes as well?
Well, you know, I talked about also that most of the landscapes we're operating have been disturbed historically, and consequently, we may be moving to have the backbone of these landscapes be generalist species. Generalist species may very well be more adaptable because they just can tolerate a wider range of conditions in general. So I think that's another way to combat it. However, I would say when the specialists are adapted to your condition, I think you should always try to include them, because they are the ones that are most at risk from climate change. So I'm kind of giving you two directions. From the big picture landscape, trying to have a big picture landscape be as adaptable as possible to changing climatic conditions means genetic diversity, meaning sexually propagated plants propagated from seed, and a significant number of generalists. But I think it's also important to include the specialists when they are adapted to your site, because those are the ones that are going to have the biggest problem in adapting to climate change, because their needs are much more precise from an environmental standpoint.
Really interesting discussion that we're having here, Larry. And we've talked a lot about the climate. We've talked about our ecoregion, but can you take it into a designer's approach now and let us know a little bit about how you start developing a design for a site?
Yes. First, I'm measuring or analyzing the disturbance, because as I've already said, it's a big factor. It's going to direct some big picture decisions. So that's one of the, when I'm talking about design, I kind of break it into two parts. One are the overall considerations that is going to drive individual plant selection, and then two is the individual plant selection. So some of the overall decisions I'm making before I'm starting to name plants include the three major habitat types. A landscape that is optimal for wildlife will include all three habitat types. in very general habitat types, which would be woodland, would be open meadow or grassland. But the one that gets left off a lot is shrub thicket. Lots of people think about the woods. They've got some woods and they want to enhance the understory in various ways. That's great. A lot of folks are thinking about changing, converting lawn to meadow, and that's all great. But the shrub thicket is a key component of any wildlife-friendly landscape. And it often, do we use shrubs often? Of course we do. There's plenty of shrubs that get used in the landscape. But shrubland as a contiguous mass of shrub-dominated area is a whole key wildlife element that many birds, insects, and other aspects of wildlife really want. So even in the small scale design that we are talking about and that we'll look at in this presentation, I'm still including all three of those habitat types. Then another overall decision I'm thinking about before I get into individual species is what competitive level am I selecting plants at? So there's a suite of plants that are adaptable to my condition or to an area on my property or to the property as a whole. If I am erring towards weed suppression and low maintenance, I am going to use very competitive native species because they are more suppressive of seed germination, meaning less weeds enter the system. If I want to move towards diversity, I will hold off on the most aggressive native species because they will outcompete the less aggressive native species. So I'm kind of picking a competitive level, either very high, kind of mid-level, or very low. Why would you want low competitive level of the plants you're selecting? Because the most competitive ones will compete out the least competitive ones, and you will end up with more plant diversity. What might drive one way or the other? One would be scale. Tiny little areas on a very small property, well, I can manage it pretty easily, typically by keeping weeds out. If I've got acreage, it's going to be very difficult. No one is going to go out and hand weed acres. So I may be upping the competitive level of the native species that I am picking. So those are some of the big picture decisions that we're making. Then when we start getting down to making a plant list, what are the specific species that we are going to select? I'm really looking at it as a plant community approach. What do I mean by that? A plant community can be defined as a group of plants that commonly grow in a similar environment, grow together in a similar environment. And here's one of the keys, that tend to occupy complementary as opposed to competitive niches in the landscape. So from a spatial standpoint, if you are looking, let's say, a meadow, of which part of our proposed design includes, you may have 5 or 6 plants in a square foot. And that, the meadow's a perennial dominant landscape. No perennial manual is going to say a proper spacing is 5 to 6 plants per square foot. That's going to be an overgrown mess. But not if it is plant community based, because those 5 plants in the same square foot, one of them is growing 2 inches prostrated on the ground. Another one is maybe 6, 8 inches and bushy. Another one may be a tall, stocky thing that pokes up through at 2 or 3 feet. And then another one of those plants might be a native grass that comes up through the whole thing and feathers out over the top of it. They are all operating at different levels in the same space. What does that mean for weed suppression? If I'm a weed seed that falls into there, I've got multiple layers to get through. That would be a very suppressive landscape. And those plants are complementing each other. 5 plants in the same square foot that all grow 18 inches tall and then feather out at the end, they're fighting. But plants that are operating at different levels have reduced competition, but they've also created a stable landscape that other plants, meaning weeds that are weed seeds that are deposited, can't germinate. Same thing is going on underground, root systems that are operating at different levels. The same thing is going from a temporal standpoint, meaning complementary niches in the landscape from a seasonal direction. There are species that are most actively growing, flowering, forming seed in the spring and the cool weather. And there are plants that are inactive, like most of our native grasses, in the spring and don't start growing until the summer. Those two plants are not competing because they're operating at two different seasons during the year. So all of these things are thought about when we have a group of plants that are adapted to our condition, native species adapted to where we are. The way we combine them is plant community based. We're looking at their growth habits and their seasonal times and trying to put together plants that are complementing as much as possible each other spatially and temporally, as opposed to competing with each other.
Fantastic. Love the layering that you mentioned. I think that's a really important step for people to keep in mind when they're planning out their gardens. We have talked a lot about the plant community, but I wanted to know specifically with your design, how does it support and preserve wildlife species native to the ecosystem?
Well, you know, as I consider Doug Tallamy, the entomologist, the most influential person in horticulture, oddly enough, these days, as he makes the case very clear. Native insects, birds, and other fauna are adapted specifically to native plants, and consequently, using them is certainly causing the landscape to significantly ratchet up in terms of wildlife value. But there's a lot of other aspects in terms of wildlife value, and one of them is structure. I know in my backyard, which is somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of an acre, inner ring suburb of Philadelphia, the bird life is phenomenal there. And when you're watching what's going on in the backyard, the structure has a lot to do with it. There's cover on the ground. There's birds going in and out of that cover. There's various levels of branching, from large canopy trees to mid-story trees to shrubs. You watch the birds, they're not having to go from the perennial layer or the lawn all the way up to the top of a canopy tree. They're working their way to the shrub and then up to the tree. There are shrubs around tree trunks that they feel safe crawling, migrating up the tree trunk because they feel protected. So there are a lot of ways that you're putting plants together structurally, in addition to providing food and cover and the obvious things that make a landscape wildlife friendly. And I want to mention from wildlife standpoint, as well as from a management standpoint or a reduced maintenance standpoint, the ground layer is important. There is no landscape, with a very few exceptions, that we are involved in that does not contain a solid ground layer throughout. It may not be there the day it is planted before the plants have filled in, but the goal is always a solid ground layer. From a wildlife standpoint, that's optimal. And from a weed suppression standpoint, it's also optimal.
Great information. As we move on and we start looking at the site analysis that you did for your design, will you tell us a little bit about some of the things that need to be considered prior to even planting the garden? So if someone took your design and wanted to install it in their backyard in Washington, D.C., what would be some of the first steps that you would take in that process?
Well, we certainly would always do soil analysis, and it's not a special soil analysis oriented towards ecology-based design. It's basically the extension services that provide them in your state. That's what we're using. However, we're interpreting the results very differently than traditional horticulture or landscape design would. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, if you're growing a vegetable garden or you're growing turf, those plants generally want high levels of fertility. When you're selecting the plants that are adapted to the soil conditions that you already have, they've already got what they want. They don't need supplemental fertilizer. They don't need additional compost. They're basically adapted to where you're putting them. Now, if you increase the fertility level a little bit, would it make them maybe grow faster? Yeah, probably would. But who else is going to grow faster? The weeds. So if you're trying to have a low maintenance landscape, the best way to do that is to pick the plants that don't need much beyond the soil conditions that are already there, and then don't start supplementing to get them to grow faster, because low maintenance means, all the things you do in maintenance, weeding takes up the vast majority of it. And so we're not looking at plants in a landscape. That same plant in a pot might benefit from a little fertilizer, it might grow faster, but it's out in the landscape. And one thing that I would mention that's different about this approach is, and if you look at our design, there isn't lawn. The front lawn is a meadow. And so consequently, even in a small property, when I say we're operating at a bigger scale and we can't be as precise and universal with weeding, so we need to have the plants do a lot of that work. Nothing is no maintenance, but we can reduce it. If all we're doing is little bed areas, well, you can pretty much weed that. If you took your front lawn and turned it into something else, even if it's not a big front lawn, it's a big garden. So now you're asking the plants to do the work for you. And those plants are now, if you're not pulling every single weed that comes up between them, you're asking those plants to win the battle. The plants you put there are adapted to what they already have soil-wise. Fertilization, higher fertility is going to help the weeds more than the plants, so we don't do that. Some of the things that we're looking at very closely in soil analysis is pH. pH is a major driver of which species will thrive and which won't. In the eastern United States, the majority of areas are acidic on the acidic side, but there are certainly exceptions where there are limestone veins and other things. And if you get a higher pH reading, neutral or high or alkaline, there's a suite of plants that you're going to want to use in that condition. If it's very acid, there's a suite of plants that you're going to want to use for that condition. So we're looking very closely at pH and porosity, which has to do with nutrient and soil retention and aeration. We certainly want to know if we have a highly drained, highly aerated sand versus a dense clay where water does not percolate quickly, which are things that any good horticulturist would be considering in their plant selection.
Well, oftentimes we find ourselves not working with a clean slate when we're looking to do a garden installation. Can you talk a little bit about some of the more problematic or undesirable species that our gardeners might encounter and how best to control them?
A really good question, a really big question. And if you ask me, what is the biggest hurdle to establishing these landscapes beyond the garden bed, I can weed every little weed scale. It's aggressive weedy plants, many of which are on the invasive plant lists. So you want to be researching what plants you want to establish. You also need to be researching the weeds that you have present on your site or that are nearby or adjacent to your site that you can expect once you stop mowing lawn to have a presence. And basically, the idea is to understand the particular weed and its vulnerabilities. For instance, an annual weed like Japanese stiltgrass is treated very differently than a perennial weed like mugwort or chrysanthemum weed. The same thing, two different common names. One is an aggressive perennial, comes back year after year, has a very migratory root system. The other, stiltgrass, is an annual. They are both problematic weeds, but they are treated very differently. For example, and there are many folks where it's very easy to waste your time if you don't understand the weed. For instance, if Japanese stiltgrass is an annual, that means that that plant that's in your garden today is going to die over the winter. And what's going to come back next year are the seeds that that plant distributed. So if I go out and have Japanese stiltgrass is a problem on my property, and I go out and fastidiously weed it in October, what have I done? I've done nothing, because the plant was going to die anyway, and it's already dispersed its seeds. I wasted a lot of effort. So you can go through this with each individual weed or categorize them, but perennial versus annual / biennial means the plant's going to come back every year from the same root system. Annual biennial means that plant can't persist over a long period of time if it doesn't disperse seeds into the landscape. So your job there is to prevent it from going to seed. The job of a perennial weed, such as mugwort or Canada thistle, is to get rid of the plant because it is going to come back year after year from the root system. You really, what's going on here is that you're really looking at the landscape as a big picture, determining what's desirable, what's undesirable, and starting to look at the individual plants, both desirable and undesirable, and figure out strategies for either suppressing them or encouraging them.
Fantastic. You've given us great information about getting started, and where we're headed in our design is our plant palette. And you put together an incredible plant list for this design. I know that you focused on plants that are native to Northern Virginia, where we have a seedling chapter. And for our members that are in chapters in the Blue Ridge Mountains to the west, or a little bit further south in Richmond, or even closer to the coast, what substitutions would you consider making from the existing list that you put together for the design that you did for Washington, D.C.?
Right. And the plant selection that we used are plants that in our experience can tolerate a wide variety of conditions, including disturbed conditions that are not analogous precisely to the historic conditions those plants would have grown in. So one of the things we did is use plants that are fairly broad-based. Now, you can get more precise than my plant list. The plant list that we put together is applicable because it's broad-based, but you could get more precise. And how do you do that? Basically look at the botanical floras, and particularly those that are organized around plant community, to get an initial plant list. If you are in the coastal plain of Virginia, there are plant community references that tell you wet meadow species, mesic forest, which is between wet and dry. There are names of the different plant communities. Each plant community in that region, meaning the Atlantic coastal plain of Virginia, has specific named plant communities. And if you go to a flora that is organized by the named plant communities of your state, you're going to get a list of all the plants that are in that community. And that can be the basis for your design. Then within that list, to kind of refer to the competitive levels, that was a decision I made early on. So now I got a list of the coastal plain plant community where I live. And within that list, there's some plants that are highly competitive, native desirable species, and some that are less so. So I said early on, I'm picking a competitive level. And it might be different in the perimeter areas of my property. It might be a higher competitive level right around the house, a lower competitive level, because I want it to be more intricate and it's smaller so I can weed it. Out in the perimeters, I want to be less, require less maintenance. So I'm picking a higher level of plants. So within that list, that plant community list that I got from a plant community-based flora, I'm deciding which competitive level I want to be. That's how you would pair plants. There is no point putting a highly aggressive bee balm next to a Marshallia. I forgot the common name of that plant, because yeah, they both may be somewhat shady woodland edge plants, but one is a little diminutive thing and one is an aggressive root colonizer, and you'll end up with only the aggressive plant.
When I know that our Delmarva contingent, between having chapters in Baltimore, the nation's capital region, and Silver Springs, Maryland, are excited to know that they can make some minor substitutions based on their particular region, but kind of use this as a roadmap where you've shown that competitive nature being further away, a little bit less competitive closer to the house. But if we were looking to scale up on a much bigger way, so if this is a property that might be 2 or 3 acres in size, how would you go about scaling that up? Would you look for more competitive plants to reduce the amount of maintenance, or how might you really scale this design up for a much larger property?
Yeah, it would be scaling, selecting plants at a higher. I am so sorry. I thought I turned the volume completely off there, and it still rang. Basically, the scale is one determinant of how high a competitive level you're picking plants. Don't ask little slow-growing diminutive things to cover acres, and don't ask highly aggressive plants to cover to play nicely with other plants in a 10 by 10 foot square garden. So a lot of it has to do with selecting the appropriate competitive level of the native species to your area that for the scale that they will be asked to dominate, basically, or form a stable, relatively stable composition.
And do you see that reflective in your selection, choosing whether to go seed or container grown or balled and burlapped plant material as well?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Obviously, when you get into the large scale, particularly with herbaceous plants, you almost have to be using seed. You can't buy enough live plants to fill a 10 acre or even necessarily a 1 acre meadow planting. We are often planting both seeds and live plants, and that can be a part of the program in the large and small scale. In the large scale, the seed composition may be covering everything, and there may be pockets of live plants in prominent places as an additional design element. In the small scale, small suburban or even urban yard, it would be the opposite. Live plants are dominating because in that scale, we want to have more control, but seed can have a place too. For instance, a typical landscape, whether it's native or not, you plant the plants in a predetermined arrangement. And even if you want them to grow together as a solid cover, they don't do that the day they are planted. They're too small. So what happens temporarily before solid cover between those individual plants? In a typical landscape, there would be mulch. And in this case, the mulch is temporary because the plants will fill in and then you don't need to do it anymore. But another approach is to bring seed into it. Instead of mulching the space between the plants that will eventually fill in, a seed mix of short-lived, fast-growing native species can be used to fill that space, and those plants will eventually get outcompeted by the plants that were planted live and spaced out, that were likely perennials that would come back every year. So a early stage annual/biennial seed mix can be a replacement for mulch. Why would you want to do that? A bunch of reasons. One, mulch has no wildlife value to speak of, whereas if you're planting native biennials, black-eyed Susan, blue vervain, other things as an interim temporary planting, that has plenty of wildlife value. From a weed suppression standpoint, 18 inches of dense vegetation will suppress weeds better than an inch of mulch. And from an aesthetic standpoint, some people kind of like mulch. I'm not in that world. Black-eyed Susan and dotted mint and all these really beautiful annual biennial fast-growing plants are much more beautiful than a mulch bed while you're waiting for the plants to fill in. So you can use both at all scales, but you're using them a little differently, and you're weighting them differently.
Really interesting. The mix that you were talking about in your designer notes, you bring up the term matrix. And for a lot of people, this might be a relatively new approach to garden design. And I know you've already started talking about those components, but can you talk just a little bit more about what exactly is that matrix pattern that you're suggesting to use in the design installation?
Yeah, it's very closely related to the idea of plant compositions based on plant communities. And a matrix is basically a group of plants that tend to be intermingled and that tend to be a major player. When we say the main matrix of a landscape, that's the composition of intermingled species that likely covers a large area of the landscape. And then accents might be smaller insertions into that main matrix. So I'd say the two categories that describe what I mean by matrix is it tends to be intermingled compositions based on the spatial niches of the plant community, as I described earlier. And it also means it's a major player covering large area of the landscape and maybe running through other things. In other words, there may be a shrub mass and there may be a meadow that's the main matrix. Well, that meadow might run right through the shrubs. So the matrix is the big player, and it's intermingled. The accents, the micro habitats, if you're small little patches, recognizing different environmental conditions from an ecological standpoint, accents, if you're looking at it from an aesthetic standpoint, would be inserted into the main matrix.
Perfect. And when you're looking at installation timing, you recommended planting during the spring and fall to reduce the need for irrigation. What does a newly planted garden need in terms of water and overall care from an irrigation standpoint?
Yeah, as far as permanent irrigation, I've been doing this for, I think it's 40 years now. And I have never recommended permanent irrigation in our landscapes. My job is to pick the plants that can tolerate the climatic conditions that they're being placed in, the soil conditions they be placed in. Does that mean that in an extreme drought, that plant will look just as happy and big and lush as it would with normal rainfall? No, but it won't die. It will tolerate the condition. It will react to the condition by semi-dormancy or lesser growth. But long-term, we are really not irrigating. And it's similar to fertilization. Over-irrigating plants that don't need it is helping the weeds more than it's helping the plants that you plant. And you really need to let the plants hold back the weeds because you're operating at a bigger scale once you get out of the garden bed. Now, as far as temporary irrigation, seeded landscapes, more times than not, we don't irrigate at all. If it doesn't rain for 3 weeks, the seed just sits there, and when it rains, it germinates. If it doesn't rain for 6 or 8 weeks, the seed sits there until it rains, and then it germinates when it gets sufficient rain. Live plants, whether they're little plugs or potted perennials or potted shrubs or balled and burlap shrubs, those need to be kept reasonably moist or not allowed to dry out until they have gotten sufficient root establishment. So what we are doing with live plants is setting up temporary irrigation systems that generally is designed or kept in place to get it through the first hot summer. And I will mention that spring and fall is pretty typical for horticulture. If you consider watering difficult because it's either somewhat remote from your water source or it's just a big area, I would recommend planting in early fall. And the reason for that is if I'm a plant and I go in the ground early fall, September, I'm growing roots in September, October. If I'm in the DC area, November, very possibly the soil temperatures are still warm enough into December that I'm still growing roots. Now I shut down, and now in March or April, it's warming up pretty soon. I'm growing roots again. I might have 6, 7 months of root establishment before I hit my first dry summer. If I plant in the spring, even if I get it in, let's say early April, I got April, May, middle of June, I can already be really hot. That's like 2.5 months. That makes a big difference. It's all about, if I'm saying an established plant, a native plant adapted to the conditions does not require irrigation once it's established. The idea is to get it established, give it as much cool season establishment as possible before it hits the summer.
That's a really good point. Really good point. And you mentioned drought stress. What does that typically present in the land, or how does that typically present in the landscape when you're dealing with native plants? At what point do you intervene with either irrigation or fertilization?
Yeah, fertilization we never do. Irrigation, obviously, you plant live plants, you need to keep them alive, but we don't like to specify, water twice a week to X number of inches. What we specify is check out the soil. And when it starts looking dry, that's the time to water it. Or if you see the most vulnerable plants start to get a little temporary wilt, what I'm saying is don't water until the plants need it.
Yeah.
And it's not because, you can overwater plants, obviously. You can water more than I'm saying, and you won't overwater plants, but you're going to be encouraging more weeds. Mm-hmm. You're dealing with a landscape that is dynamic. It's not just growing an individual plant. It's not what's best just for that plant you're trying to grow. It's what will give it a competitive edge. And if you're doing something that on the surface seems good for the plant you're trying to grow, but it's helping the weeds more than that plant, then you're at a net loss, and you're going to have to spend more time maintaining maintaining it. A lot of things going on behind the scenes that are not obvious that play into this kind of landscape being low maintenance. It's not low maintenance just because you threw some native plants at it. It's low maintenance because all of these components are kind of thought through, from selection of plants adapt to the situation to not to holding back on things, particularly in the early stages when those plants are not established enough to outcompete weeds. You're in that when you first plant, you're in that situation where weed seeds are going to germinate. Your plants are in there, whether it's germinating or live plants, and your job is to hold back the weeds to the point where your plants dominate, and then it's kind of easy. That hard part is that transition first year or two or three is when you're trying to manipulate the vegetation. Once the desired vegetation is universal and solid, the maintenance needs go way, way down because seed germination is now way, way down. And you're just picking off the odd plants that can find their way through, not trying to keep weeds from growing in vast areas of mulch or bare soil between plants anymore.
And we've talked about weeding through plant selection. We've talked about it through selective irrigation. But what ways do you recommend people removing weeds when they do become a problem, or how do you prevent them from taking over during that establishment phase or once they've been established? What are your tactics for weed management?
Yeah, that's a great question. That leads to another ecological process that people don't think about, but have a huge effect on what they're doing, and weeding. All right. So let's say I've determined that I always want a dense ground layer composition to suppress weeds, but there's going to be a few that are going to find their way through. How do I get rid of it manually? Well, a good gardener is going to get in there and pull it by the roots and try to get every single root they possibly can. If you're following the horticultural tradition, the appropriate protocols. I would differ from that. And the reason I would differ is because of the ecological process called disturbance and the effect that disturbance has on seed germination. If I have a plant growing through a dense cover, I would rather cut it at the base, meaning ground level, underneath that dense cover, than pull it by the roots. Why? If I pull it by the roots, I've created a disturbance. Soil disturbance encourages seed germination. So by pulling a weed, most of the seeds in our soil, especially in the early stages of a planting, are weeds, let's face it. So if I pull a weed, I've created a soil disturbance, which encourages seed germination, which is likely to be more weeds. So continually traveling around a garden and pulling weeds by the roots is continual disturbance, which encourages seed germination, which means you're actually encouraging more weeds. What we want to achieve is a situation where disturbance is minimal and we are in an ecological condition called relative ecological stability. That's when there is a solid cover over the ground and seed germination can occur, but at very small levels. So if I cut that plant at the base underneath my cover or already established cover, will it reemerge? Yeah, but it's underneath everything else. It's getting very little light. It lost. It had to use storage food in the roots to regrow. It couldn't photosynthesize for a period. So on 3 levels, you've weakened that plant. The plants surrounding it have not been weakened in any way, shape, or form. So even if you have to cut a plant 2 or 3 times in successive maintenance sessions, it takes so much less time to cut a plant than pull it by the roots that you're still either ahead of the game or equal in terms of the time you spent, but you're not continually disturbing. So the weeds are going to go down over time as the plants become even more dense and established. Now, when I say that, I want to make it clear that the cutting at the base only is effective if you have a solid cover that those plants got through. If a weed comes up in a mulch bed and you cut it to the ground, as soon as it pops back up, it's got light and it can photosynthesize and there's no competition. So this is about getting established cover, then cutting the weeds at the base underneath the cover instead of pulling by the roots. And of course, there are exceptions. some of the most pernicious weeds, such as Japanese knotweed or mugwort, I wouldn't do that. They're too aggressive. I would get in there and either paint them with an herbicide or fastidiously remove them by the roots, which is not an easy thing to do, depending on how widespread they are.
Exactly. In your designer notes, you mentioned some key tasks to the management of the garden. Can you outline a couple of the other tasks beyond weeding and irrigating?
Yeah, so we're irrigating, we're backing off of once the plants are established, generally through the first summer. Weeding, I just talked about. And of course, herbicide is a possible way too. And I certainly didn't get in this business because I love herbicides, but the word using herbicide can mean a lot of different things. And obviously some materials have a longer persistence in the landscape than others, maybe more environmental problematic than those. But it's also how you're applying. If I'm going to spray a field with herbicide, well, I put a lot of herbicide out there, and the environmental effect may be obviously more significant. However, if I paint herbicide on an individual plant, I haven't really distributed that herbicide into the landscape. It just went on the leaves of that plant. So kind of going around the garden and painting plants may be a pretty environmental way to do it. And particularly if you've got one of those really aggressive weeds that I talked about, that cutting at the base isn't going to cut it, to use a pun. You basically may want to use one of these very precise uses of herbicide, or not. I'm not here to argue for or against that. But know the strength of the weed you're dealing with. If you're dealing with a Japanese knotweed, don't pretend you went in there, you pulled the roots as best you could and walk away and never come back. In fact, the idea of pulling an aggressive weed because you just couldn't cut it, it was too aggressive, the key there is to revisit it frequently until it is gone. You pull mugwort or Japanese knotweed by the roots, I guarantee you didn't get all the roots. Those plants will come back. Maybe you got 50% of the roots, so 50% came back. If you leave it to grow back, photosynthesize, send food back to the roots, and then go and do it again, well, it regained everything it lost, and you're never getting anywhere. If you go back and do it, repeat your removal by the roots as soon as it started to emerge, instead of after it's emerged and hung out for a while, it goes for a long period without any photosynthetic activities, and that plant will eventually find its demise.
Great. And I know you had other recommendations in terms of cutting back and also providing some small amounts of mulch when necessary in your designer notes. But as we start moving into phasing in the design and getting ready to install things, sometimes we don't always have the resources to install the entire design at one time. Can you give us a recommendation on how to install in phases as our resources allow?
Sure. And I will go back to your previous question because I neglected one important thing regarding cutting back perennials. We cut back perennials in the early spring before the new growth emerges, not in the fall when it's typically done. And the reason is there are insects laying their eggs on these standing stems. And so from a wildlife standpoint, and the stems often are providing cover. So from a wildlife standpoint, it's better to leave all that material up through the winter, and even leave some decent, when you cut them back, maybe leave 6 inches or 8 or a foot there, because even in the spring, having some stems still remaining is a good thing. So I just wanted to mention that. And can you repeat the question you went to next?
Yeah, no worries. We were looking at phasing, so we don't always have the resources to put everything all in at once. How would you phase the garden installation of a new native garden?
Good. First of all, I would design it not in phases. So as implementing a landscape design in phases happens more times than not for our clients and most people that do this. And it's absolutely fine. But it's best to kind of design as a whole, so that you're not doing disparate pieces that aren't related to each other. When you're taking a section of the landscape as phase 1 or 2 or 3, when the whole thing is done, it will be cohesive. But the two basic ways that phasing can occur by area: the front yard first, the backyard first, second, but it also can be phased by plant type. You could plant all of the trees, then you could plant the whole shrub layer, then you could plant the herbaceous layer, meaning the perennials and grasses and ferns. You wouldn't do it the opposite, because if you plant all these ground layer plants and then you're going to come in and dig a bunch of big holes for trees, you will disrupt it. So it can be by layers, height layers, starting from the top and moving down, or it can be by individual area. And you know, which individual area, it can be just which is most important to you. It can also be if you're going to need to get a machinery across the front yard to do the backyard, you know, maybe you want to think about that too, but that gets into practical matters.
One of the more practical things that I have a question about is oftentimes hardscape elements are really expensive and can add to a budget very quickly. For those of us like myself that got a new house that are on a tight budget, what are some opportunities from the plant palette that you could use to replace pathways, walkways, or elements where that typically would be in hardscape? Are there fescues that you'd recommend, or other native grasses or ground covers that can handle that type of foot traffic and activity?
Sure. One thing in meadow plantings, we are rarely, the paths are basically, the meadow seeding goes right through the paths, and then we mow the paths where we want them to be. They may have been pre-designed or they may be ad hoc after the fact, but the path is just mowed meadow. Now it can be a turf type grass, but if it is a turf type grass, fescues are the best. Why? Because fescues are clump forming as opposed to expanding clonal root systems. And if you plant like Kentucky bluegrass, would be a clonal root system. It's a mat forming grass. So if you use that grass as a path, it's migrating into the edges of the meadow. It's not likely to run like wildfire through the whole meadow, but it gets out of the mow zone because it's now into the meadow. Those types of grasses burn up in the summer. You know what lawn does in the summer if you don't irrigate it, gets floppy. And so the edges of your meadow where they meet the path can be very ugly. So if you're going to put a, not just mow the meadow, which is the vast majority, if not like really vast majority of what we do, I would say use a fescue type grass. And then there are native monocots, meaning grass-like plants that can be used. And one of them would be a path rush or Juncus tenuis, which tolerates a lot of foot traffic and can be mowed, and is not a rhizomatous mat-forming grass that would extend into the meadows. And I'd also mention from a phasing standpoint, let's say you were going to put in a walkway, but a stone walkway through the meadow area. And you have a bit of a conundrum because there's going to be some disruption. You don't want to spend the money on the walkway. You want to plant the meadow, but you don't want to rip the meadow up at the same, you know, after in order to put the new walkway in. Sometimes you can just put a gravel walkway in temporarily with a little bit of a base, and then put the stone in later so that you're not digging it up. In other words, the base for the stone, which is inexpensive, is already there, and you just put a thin, attractive gravel layer over it. And then when it comes time to do the stone, actually put the stone layer, you don't really dig anything up. You just rake off an inch of gravel and then lay the stone on the base that you already put in. So there's kind of ways to get what you want done when you want to do it, without disrupting things later.
That's really informative, and I really like the idea of using path rush for our paths. Is there anything else you'd like to share that we haven't touched on yet?
Oh, there's all kinds of things to talk about, but I will say, you know, on our plan, it's a very small scale landscape, and you know, there's two kind of categories of environmental benefits that come out of native plant landscapes. And one is the wildlife, water retention, and all the environmental benefits that will accrue on your property. And then the second category is the influence that your property will have on the surrounding landscape. And there's two influences. One, seeds are moving out. So when you're planting native plants, your neighborhood is receiving more seeds of native plants. They're not just staying on your property. So you're, to some extent, positively affecting the landscape around you. But there's something that's not so obvious, and that's the aesthetic aspect of it. If I'm living in a neighborhood, a tight, relatively dense neighborhood where everybody sees everybody else's front lawn, and I plant a landscape that is unkempt and overly wild, but has tremendous wildlife value, but to most people looks unattractive. What's the difference environmentally if it's got good wildlife habitat? The difference is your neighbors are not going to do it because they don't like it. If it's beautiful, they will be much more likely to adopt that landscape. So the ecological influence of what you did will be multiplied. So how do you do that? One of the things in our design that you'll see is, let's look at the front yard. The main matrix, going back to that word, is an intermingled multi-species meadow composition. We use plants that are relatively short, not big and tall and ungainly. But another key thing that happened in there is there are spots on the edges that are single species. In other words, the main matrix, a lot of plants mixed together, a little wild, but then there's patches where you come up the front yard, front walkway, meeting the sidewalk at the front door, where we have what I would call accent patches of one species, which is much more simple. Now, when you look at that landscape, you see simplicity. You see something that is repeating throughout the landscape that is very simple and legible and kind of making sense of all the intermingled wild stuff. So I think that adapting what you're doing to the aesthetic character of the neighborhood, not doing what they do, you're obviously likely to have a different approach, but understand what will look appropriate and maybe be more accepted by and that's very doable. You don't need to diminish the ecological value of the landscape by making it attractive and understand aesthetics. So I'm not a restoration ecologist. I was trained as a garden designer. I'm drawing in spades from restoration ecology, but I never threw away the garden design hat. You know, a restoration ecologist is just out there working for the wildlife and for nature. I'm working for the wildlife and nature, but I'm also working for people. So I have to make sure that everything I do almost is also going through the sieve of both garden design, aesthetics, experience, as well as habitat and environmental benefits.
Fantastic. And I think you're going to have a lot of people bringing that aesthetic to their own landscape after getting a chance to see the design that you put together for the Washington, D.C. area. Thank you so much for sharing your talent and expertise in the development of this design and walking us through it today. The design that we've been mentioning, Larry's Washington, D.C. design, the plant list, the designer notes, and a list of regional native plant nurseries can be found online at nativegardendesigns.wildones.org. It's on the screen there too. And I know you've probably gotten a chance to check out some of the other regions as well. Your feedback helps us to continually improve our webinars, and we ask that you please complete a short survey after viewing this program. Thank you again, Larry, for joining us, and we hope you feel inspired and empowered to plant more native plants in your community. Thank you, and have a fantastic day.
Thank you, Matthew, and thanks for all those who attended.